Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Middle East Institute event in partnership with the Committee to Protect Journalists. Eid Mubarak to those of you celebrating. My name is Dion Nissenbaum. I'm a reporter with the Wall Street Journal, and I'll be moderating this panel, Censorship, Surveillance, and Imprisonment, Media Under Threat in the Middle East. As many of you probably know, the Middle East is considered the toughest and most dangerous region for journalists. The most recent CPJ report said that there were 274 journalists in jail for their work as of December 2020. That's a new record. And nearly 90 of those, a third of them, are in the Middle East. After China and Turkey, Egypt ranks third worst in the world for jailing journalists. And the pandemic has given governments like Egypt another tool to crack down on journalists. And we're going to hear from one of them today. Press freedoms in the Middle East continue to shrink at an alarming rate. And we've got an amazing group of panelists to talk about it today. I'm joined by Lina Atullah, the co-founder of Mada Masr, who is named one of Time Magazine's 100 most influential people in 2020. Zahra Hakir, a journalist and author of an amazing book of essays, Are Women on the Ground? Definitely encourage all of you to get that. She's at work on a new book about the cultural history of eyeliner, which I'm looking forward to, and I hope you are too. From Aden, we have Ali Mahmoud Mohammed, a journalist and contributor to The National. And we have Justin Shalad, a senior researcher for the Middle East and North Africa with the Committee to Protect Journalists. Throughout the next hour, we're going to discuss threats facing women journalists in the region, difficulties trying to preserve the independent press in the region, and generally the challenges facing press freedom. You'll have an opportunity to ask questions in the Zoom Q&A feature, which I'm sure all of you are pretty familiar with at this point. If you're calling in or joining on the live stream, you can submit your questions by emailing events@mei.edu. And if you have any other problems, you can email events@mei.edu. And with that, turn it over to Lina in Cairo for some opening comments.
Thank you so much, Diane, and hello everyone, and also Eid Mubarak to those of us celebrating in the world. I also must apologize for not being very coherent. I came to the panel a bit of a last minute, especially that we've been busy covering what's happening in the Palestinian territories and all what's happening there. But the good news in pointing to that is to basically say that we continue to be able to work and to engage and to produce independent journalism at a time where the space allowing it is shrinking like never before. At least this has been the case for me, being a journalist who has operated out of Egypt primarily, and to some extent in the North Africa, Middle East region. To some extent, it hasn't been as difficult as it has been now, engaging with events and producing critical accounts of what's happening around us, both in Egypt and around us. Yet, like I said, the fact that we continue to exist is in and of itself a sign that there's a way to continue. There is that margin that we continue to operate in. I work at Mada Masr, which is a Cairo-based news website that has been born in 2013, which is held for many of us in Egypt as the year where we saw yet another, where we saw a major political transformation in power and how we are ruled, but also another sort of milestone of how independent voices, opposition in general, independent voices, civil society is treated by those in power. It's a milestone in the sense that the challenges have been quite unprecedented in terms of restrictions that are manifested both through the law, and we've seen an expansion of the use of law as, unfortunately, as a tool of repression for journalists, but also for both independent and opposing voices in the country, but also outside the scope of the law. I mentioned it's unprecedented, again, given the fact that I've operated in the country under the rule of Mubarak during the revolution and after. There is definitely something to account for in terms of how restricted the environment feels. Yet I have to say that although it's not very clear, how exactly we're still able to operate as an independent media, our existence is proving every day the centrality of and the central need for independent media in this country, in the sense that Egypt, like other countries in the region, is a country that witnessed a relative liberalization and opening in the media landscape at the beginning of the 2000s, and this offered people the possibility of consuming different narratives than those engineered by the state and by the authorities. And the sudden and extreme severance of these alternative accounts is something that people are feeling, people who have grown accustomed to political TV, to some diverse voices. And this is providing us with the steam that we need to continue doing what we're doing, is that we feel that people need independent media. They need quality produced information. They need to engage in intelligent conversations. And we never lose faith in this need. In a way, this is sort of the fuel that fuels our engines to continue doing the work we're doing. So these are some quick opening thoughts for now.
Great, thank you. Definitely want to come back and talk to you a little bit more about how you are able to operate there under such difficult circumstances. Let's go to Lebanon, where Zahra has been doing some amazing reporting. She went there from London after the Beirut blast to report on people on the ground. And Zahra, take it away.
Hi, Diane. Thanks for the intro, and thanks MEI for hosting us, and Eid Mubarak to everybody who's celebrating. As Diane mentioned, I have edited a book, which is a collection of essays from Arab women journalists, so really across the region. And Lina was a participant in that book, one of the most incredible essays in it. And I would encourage everybody to buy it and read Lina's essay in particular. And I wanted to kind of draw on some of the themes that I gleaned from speaking with and working with the women, but also as someone who has mentored many young Arab women journalists across the region as well, including in places like Iraq and Yemen. So really the challenges are several, and they're multifaceted. And I did want to add to what Diane said about the region lagging in terms of press freedoms, that it also lags other regions in terms of women's rights. So we do see an intersection there where women journalists have to face the restrictions that are placed upon them in terms of their press freedoms or the lack thereof, and then also facing restrictions simply as for being women. So really the struggles often start, and I do want to say that I struggle with kind of giving these themes because I don't want to generalize so much because the region is so vast, but these are some things that I have noticed across different countries in the region. So the struggles often start at home. So oftentimes women who decide to pursue the career a career in journalism will often see some form of sort of hesitation from their immediate family, whether that's their parents or their partners, because of the risks that they take on the ground, and also for societal reasons. And then that struggle extends to societal obstacles, including freedom of movement, perceptions of women in this line of work and sexual harassment as well. And then that then extends to problems in the workplace, which include sexual harassment, being prevented from covering certain assignments, a lack of physical protections, and then also not being taken seriously. And then that extends further to problems at the state or the non-state level, in which certain actors will impose restrictions that will come in the form of active suppression, actual threats on one's life or detention. And this in particular happens in places where there is some form of societal upheaval or conflict. As we know, that's pretty much across the region. And then that extends further when it comes to online threats and harassment being pursued and attacked by troll armies. So as you can see, the challenges facing women are certainly pretty much in every area of their professional lives when they pursue journalism as a career, but also personally, the risks are very high. These women are working in their homelands. They're not foreign correspondents who are coming into these countries and then leaving. So there's, the toll on mental health. There's the fear for the risks on their own families. So often when they are threatened, those threats will then extend to their families as well. So that is just kind of a broad overview. And I would love to talk a little bit later about sort of online harassment. I've faced a lot of these issues myself, certainly not as much as people in other countries, given that I'm Lebanese and there are more press freedoms here, but there are certain restrictions. Women are often harassed and threatened online. There are certain red lines that journalists are expected to adhere to. If they cross those red lines, one of those is Hezbollah and criticism of Hezbollah. If they cross those red lines, they certainly face harassment. And then there's also self-censorship. So knowing that if I say something or do something that will agitate the status quo, that will then have an impact on me, a personal impact on me. So therefore, I'm avoiding covering those issues, not me specifically, but just generally. So those are some of the issues.
Great, thank you, Zahra. We definitely will circle back on some of the stuff on online harassment and what's changed. Let's go to Yemen, to Aden. Ali's covering one of the conflicts that's hardest for foreign journalists to cover. Nobody can get in there, and Ali provides a window into a conflict that many of us are unable to see. So Ali, tell us a little bit about the perspective from you.
Hello?
Yep, we can hear you.
Thanks, Diane. Hi, everybody. Eid Mubarak for those who are celebrating Eid al-Fitr tonight. I'm so pleased to join this gathering today from Aden. The story here in Yemen, all over Yemen, is different. Journalists are paying the biggest price for the 6-year conflict. What can I tell you about the lots of sufferings that we are facing since the war just started? I can't brief it, but in fact, what we have been facing is like it is very tragic, because we are the most vulnerable segment in this country. We are facing a lot of problems, as you know, as you have been following what has been doing all over the country, either in the north or in the south. You have been following how many of my colleagues, how many of my friends in Sana'a, in the Houthi held territory, have been detained, have been tortured, have been imprisoned, have been badly treated, and also many have been sentenced to penalties and to death, and lots of them spent long years behind bars, and when they some of them, when they freed in the last year, they have been suffering lots of psychological and mental problems due to the torture and the sick treatment that they were exposed to. The situation here for journalists is very bad. this is what can I tell you, because everybody is treating us like enemies, not journalists. Everybody is saying us like a threat for their power, for their control. The journalist in Yemen is an enemy for all. Everybody is treating you like an enemy. You don't have, you either report as they like, otherwise your life, your future is on potential threat. We face a lot of problems while covering the everyday life, the everyday events that occur in conflict country. You know, we have lots of militias, and in our daily life, we have to deal with those people, and we lack the protection. Nobody pay attention to us, to protect the work that we do. So what we do is how to manage, how to protect ourselves away from, because you know, militias are spread all over the country. Everywhere you have to deal with certain kind of militias, and every militia has its own agenda, and you have to either adopt their agenda, otherwise you are an enemy. This is the problem. Unfortunately, I can't tell you, we as journalists, we feel so frustrated with the International Federation of Journalists, and you, the CPJ, you don't do much or that the expected effort to protect us in Yemen. I can say, I'm sorry to tell you this. We are expecting you to put much pressure on those who are in power, the political, you know, now the political actors, they are running in this country to respect and to pay attention to us like journalists, because we feel that they do this, they harass us, they threaten us because they are not being held accountable. If they feel that the international community is paying attention to the journalists in this country, I'm sure they will not do it. They, at least journalists, they will have like a wider space to move. But because a journalist can be killed, can be tortured, can be imprisoned just easily, everybody will do it and go, because there is no accountability, because no protection. Nobody will ask them why you did this. You are going to be held accountable for this. So I hope we see, I mean, those who are in charge of protecting journalists and truth dealers all over the world to pay more attention to us in Yemen, because we are really suffering. That's it.
Thank you. I definitely want to come back and circle around on this question about how effective international pressure is across the region, and certainly give Justin a chance to talk about what CPJ is doing. And Justin, if you want to do that now, you're welcome to, or we can circle back on the Q&A, but I'll hand it off to you for some opening comments about what you're seeing from your perspective, and then we'll go to questions and answers. And then the Q&A box in the Zoom is open for questions from people that are listening in.
Hi, thank you, Dion. Thank you to MEI for hosting this event. Welcome everyone who's tuning in. Eid Mubarak, we're celebrating. And thank you, Lina, Zahra, and Ali for your perspectives, which are really invaluable. What I want to do is zoom out a little bit and give the perspective of press freedom in the region and what is necessary from an international advocacy perspective. So, and I want to start on that by thanking Ali and really calling attention to your comments on that, because this is something that us at CPJ, others in the nonprofit advocacy community, and really the entire international community do need to double down on in terms of very forcefully calling out, documenting, and taking actions to counteract the deterioration in press freedom that we see in Yemen, in Iraq, and Syria throughout the region. And as Dion alluded to by citing our statistics at the beginning, it is definitely a marked deterioration. What we do at the Committee to Protect Journalists, we're globally focused, and we document to the best of our ability attacks against press freedom worldwide, and we advocate for governments around the world and for the international community to take them seriously and to hold perpetrators to account. I think that Dion did a good job at the beginning of giving an overview of the numbers that we've seen in the region, that last year we've seen a record number of journalists imprisoned worldwide. There were 89 in the Middle East, North Africa region. There have recently been some high profile releases of journalists who were imprisoned throughout the region, which I can come back to that a bit later on, the dynamics behind that. But the point is clear, is that the situation has been deteriorating, and this does call for more forceful action from the international community. I think to give some context to some of the numbers that are available on our website and that Dion mentioned earlier, we see that Egypt had, as of December 1st, 2020, had the most journalists behind bars in the region with 27, followed by Saudi Arabia. And then we also saw journalists imprisoned in Morocco, in Iraq, in the Kurdistan Regional Government region, and in Israel. And I think what is a common thread here is that we have seen these numbers, particularly in Egypt and Saudi Arabia, jump in recent years. And this also comes as we have seen the United States and other members of the international community deepen their engagements with these governments, despite the very clear concerns about press freedom and human rights overall. This is especially important because as we've seen more and more journalists being imprisoned, we've seen a much broader array of tools at the disposal of governments and authorities throughout the region that they use to crack down on journalists. We've seen the use of so-called false news laws. Before this sort of became a rhetorical cudgel in the Trump era, this had actually long been a law on the books in many countries, including Egypt, which according to our statistics, imprisons more journalists on false news charges than any other country in the world. We've also seen journalists imprisoned on charges related to national security, to supporting terrorism, and in the case of Morocco, on charges ranging from sexual assault to money laundering in circumstances that seem very suspicious. These are charges that we're seeing on the point of view of governments, internationally recognized governments, authorities in the region. And what we're also seeing is non-state actors take their cues from that as well. And we have seen that in Yemen specifically, with 4 journalists who have been held by the Houthis since 2015 under a death sentence for supposedly collaborating with the Saudi military intervention in the country. So really what we're seeing is this broadening array of legal tools and charges to give rhetorical cover for governments to imprison journalists. We're also seeing the expansive use of spyware, of surveillance technology, of countries such as the United Arab Emirates becoming hubs for the use of this sort of technology. We have, as Zahra alluded to, seen online trolling and harassment being used as a very specific weapon that is used against journalists throughout the region and coming on a state-backed level in terms of, we've seen it with Saudi, we've seen it with the United Arab Emirates, we've seen it with Oman. It's not just a spontaneous random upbringing. One last thing that I want to call attention to too is over the last decade, since 2011, we have also seen at least 50 journalists killed in the region, specifically targeted for murder. And this is not even talking about hundreds who have died covering conflicts in Syria, and Iraq, and Yemen. I think the most high profile case that we've seen is, of course, the one that's gotten a lot of attention is, of course, the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. What is noteworthy about this is that we've seen last year a similar parallel trend in Iran as well, where Ruhollah Azam was executed by the Iranian government after being lured to Iraq, kidnapped, and taken across the border. The circumstances are remarkably similar to what we saw with the targeted operation against Jamal Khashoggi, and we see this unique dynamic where two geopolitically opposed governments, Saudi Arabia and Iran, are using remarkably similar playbooks in terms of targeting the press. What all this brings up is the need for the international community to take very seriously its engagement in the region, both in terms of its relationships with governments, but also how it even intervenes and aims to resolve conflicts as well, such as those going on in Yemen, where if there's a peace settlement, what is the role of freedom of the press, protection of journalists, and where are the calls to release journalists who are being held throughout that conflict? And this is important because with the proliferation of spyware, of online trolling, and targeted murders and abductions of journalists abroad, what's happening in the region is not going to stay in the region. Thank you.
Thank you, Justin. Definitely come back. I still want to delve in a bit more about international pressure. I want to go back to Lena a little bit to start. Lena, your offices have been raided, you've been detained, your staff has been detained, you're blocked online in Egypt, yet, as you said, you are still able to operate. And you said it's not clear how you're able to operate, but do you have, it's obviously a question you have to think about. What is it that's allowed you to continue to operate under such oppressive conditions? And does public pressure and international pressure help? Because when you've been detained, when your office has been attacked, there is a big social media response. At least I see a public outpouring that seems like it helps in your case. But can you talk to us a little bit about what you think are the effective tools that you've been able to use and why you are able to operate under these conditions?
Thank you, Diane. I think the main thing for us in terms of conscious strategizing is that we continue to do our work in the most professional way possible. And I feel that there is a sense of protection that comes from the practice, even though we live in a context where there's a lot of arbitrariness in the way the repression is unfolding and is taking place. Yet I do think that working consistently in a professional way is an important tool of protection for us, is definitely something that we use consciously. And I feel that as a result of this practice, and also with the peculiarity of us being bilingual and hence being accessible to an entire worldwide community who's interested in the Egypt story or the region by and large, those two elements have provided for a sense of solidarity that we didn't quite know the extent of it until major ordeals happened, such as the raid on our office in 2019, which you mentioned, and my own detention, and later on my second detention, which I thought was going to be the end of me, and yet there was a massive wave of support coming from readers of Mada, not just in Egypt but around the world. And it definitely made a difference. All what I'm saying is that we realized its existence in crisis time. I don't think we worked very consciously for it. What we worked very consciously on is to produce the kind of credible media that would bring the solidarity by default in a way. And I think it's an important nuance to make there, that we focus on the content, we focus on building audiences, readers, loyal readers, engaged readers. And by building that, I believe that we're actually building power. And this is something that I like to say a lot. I think we're not a bunch who's interested in taking power. We're a bunch who's interested in building power. And in doing so, we get the kind of solidarity that makes all the difference in moments of crisis.
Do you think, does international pressure and public pressure help in those cases when you're detained and when your office is raided?
It totally does. Yeah.
Okay.
You muted yourself by mistake, I think, Dan.
Sorry, thanks. Zahra, you talked about the societal and public pressure for women. It seems to me that there are more and more women working in journalism these days than perhaps a generation ago. A lot of these problems have existed for forever, basically. We saw a lot of the problems really come to the international attention during the Arab Spring. Has the growth of women operating in journalism led to any changes? Has it gotten any better or any worse? And on the flip side of that, some people talk about the benefits of women working in this region. That gives women access to spaces that men don't often have to. Do you find that is a benefit, or how much does that really help?
Certainly, I would agree with the categorization of there being more and more women joining the profession. I think social media has played a huge role in that. I think we really can't underestimate the role of citizen journalists who are essentially using their social media as a tool for them to disseminate what they see on the ground. So in that sense, there are definitely more women and they have more options when it comes to how to be a journalist and the way that they package the journalism. I do think that with the use of more and more social media, that more presence online, especially now with the COVID situation, essentially in the past year, more and more people have been turning to their Twitter accounts, their Facebook accounts, or Instagram accounts to do their journalism, that we see more and more harassment, and that has real life impact in terms of mental health, but also physical and legal threats. So while there may be more women doing more work and having more visibility, the threats have increased exponentially, I would say. And I do want to note that there is some intersectionality there when it comes to how misogyny manifests, and that women of color in particular face more and more threats. Muslim women, there's also a lot of bigotry. There's also a lot of homophobia. So people who, for example, may identify as LGBTQ, which, as we know, across the region is taboo and forbidden. So the threats and the harassment are multifaceted. A lot of this comes from a recent ICFJ report that has exposed the threats that women are facing. So in terms of the positive aspect of being a woman in the region, I would say access is a big component of that, in the sense that yes, women are able to access certain spaces that are off limits, not only to male journalists, but also to foreign correspondents, whether they're female or male. I certainly have worked with women, and many of the women in my book share experiences of being able to enter, for example, private women's homes. One of the reporters was a Yemeni photojournalist, for example. She was able to enter the private homes of women while their partners were away engaged in conflict. And as such, she was able to kind of tell the story of Yemeni women in a different and critically a very creative way. And then also women are not taken seriously, and because they're not taken seriously, they're often given opportunities to do interviews or conduct interviews that they might not otherwise be able to. For example, in Sudan, Shamail al-Noor, who's one of the reporters who's featured in my book, was not taken seriously to the extent that she was given an interview with the head of the Janjaweed at the time, Musa Hilal, and then she sort of wrote this bombshell story about him having political aspirations. And this was the first such story to be written. And that was a result of her understanding profoundly that she was not being taken seriously and using that to her advantage. Another example is in Libya. Hiba Shibani was given a talk show to focus on women's issues. And, I hate that phrase, but the idea there is that, oh, what could she possibly focus on? These are women's issues. And then she used that opportunity to focus on issues of great importance, including, for example, at the time, Libyan women not being able to pass on their nationality to their children, sexual harassment, and so on. So while there are those restrictions in place, the women have been so savvy and resourceful with how they've then approached the restrictions and then risen above them. And I think especially local women journalists deserve extreme credit for that creativity and resourcefulness when it comes to the restrictions that they're facing.
And you talked a little bit earlier about the online harassment, which is becoming more vociferous and concerning all across the world. How do you personally deal with that, and how do you suggest other people try and deal with this problem?
Yeah, I appreciate you asking that. I mean, I faced it significantly late last year. I was asked, as someone who as a woman journalist who works with women in the region and who works in women's rights, I was asked to be a moderator for the W20 event. W20 is the women's arm of G20, and Saudi Arabia was hosting it that year. And I refused to host that event, and I decided to publicize my reasoning to bring attention to the fact that the event was being hosted in Saudi Arabia, even though it was virtual. And then I faced actually significant online trolling. Goes beyond trolling. It was harassment in every sense of the word. I was sent hundreds of messages on my Instagram and on my Twitter from people who were threatening me, who were mentioning, the threats were of a sexualized and gendered nature. So they were actually quite terrifying. There was mentions of threats of rape, mentions of my family, so that for me was my first major experience, I would say, with an online troll army, because that, I would say, had a political goal. The political goal was essentially to silence anyone who speaks out against that particular regime. So at the time, I started off by reporting as many accounts as I could, and then by closing off my DMs, and then removing the apps from my phone for a few days, hoping things would die down, and then really not changing my political views whatsoever, but just being a little bit more careful with my personal security. So things like enabling two-factor authentication on all of my social media accounts, because hacking is also a big thing. So you have to be really careful with these trolls, because oftentimes they will try to hack your accounts to use private information against you. So that was my first source of sort of protecting myself, my mental health, by actually, making sure that these people couldn't reach out to me anymore. But then also, from a physical security perspective, just making sure my accounts were all secure, and then really ensuring that, I spoke to people who had faced similar forms of harassment and gotten advice and support from them. So I would advise people as much as they can to protect their accounts, and to be aware that this can have a real mental health toll. There are real fears there, and my fear was that this would somehow translate into some form of physical threats, which is a valid fear. And I'm sure Justin can speak to that, which is oftentimes these threats can manifest physically as well. So my advice would not be to silence oneself, but I speak from a position of privilege, because obviously I don't live in Saudi Arabia, and at the time I was living abroad. But also to be aware of the downside of being outspoken, and to try to protect yourself to whatever degree you can. Social media companies are struggling with this type of trolling as well. So while you can report these accounts, it takes a lot more than that to protect oneself. So I'm not sure if I've answered your question there, but that's just a small example that I raised because I experienced it myself.
Yeah, Justin, do you have anything that you wanted to add to that about ways? Because Zahra's sort of talking about closing down her accounts and sort of circling the wagons here to protect yourself. And that's certainly self-protection, but as journalists, you also need to be out-facing, and you need to, stay engaged.
Yeah, I think that Zahra brought up a lot of excellent points, and that everything that you have said, Zahra, has been borne out by a lot of the conversations that we've had at CPJ, by the research that we've done. And it is something it is ubiquitous. It is disproportionately aimed at women, at female identified journalists. And it is something where I think that this gets to the core of the problem, which is that the burden often falls on the journalists themselves to protect themselves. And this is something that, we at CPJ try to come up with resources so that journalists can do that. But at the end of the day, this is a much broader problem. And there need to be conversations and actions taken, first of all, at the employer level, in the level of the newsroom. Managers, editors have to be proactive in having these discussions with journalists about online safety, but also about the very real psychological toll that this takes. In interviews that we've done with journalists such as Ghada Ois and Reeb Abdel Latif, they came back to this over and over again, just how pervasive these online attacks are, I think, because they are attacks. I don't think trolling really even summarizes the full extent of it, that they are attacks. And as Zahra said, they expressed this idea that these can translate into real life physical attacks too. That was something that Ghada made in her interview with us in terms of the trolling attacks against Jamal Khashoggi and also the invasions of privacy that we see. So it's something that it's a conversation that has to happen on the employer level, and it's a burden that editors, management have to take up. And then also it is something that the social media platforms themselves have to address too, which is that, again, this brings up the point what Zahra said, is that the burden is still on journalists, people who are being targeted to report, to block, to mute. People have told us in the past, journalists, that they feel as though they don't have a direct line to people at the social media platforms themselves, that there's really not an effective mechanism to report or mitigate this type of abuse. And I think that this is really worth noting, and especially as we've seen that the social media companies have pretty broad latitude to shut down sensitive content, including at the request of different governments around the world. So it is something like these steps need to be taken, but it can't just be on journalists who are being targeted themselves.
And I just wanted to piggyback off of that, just one small comment on the reasoning behind some of these attacks, these online attacks. Essentially, it feeds into disinformation, right? So not only are they attempting to silence the journalists, but they're also perpetuating whatever false truths that they want to perpetuate, and they do this successfully. And the online violence, especially gendered online violence, falls into this as well.
Thanks. I want to go back to Ali here and talk a little bit about your vulnerabilities in Yemen. It's interesting to note in Lena's situation, public pressure, social media pressure seems to help. There's more attention focused on her. She has a higher profile. She's been championed as a hero by Time Magazine. But you're in a vulnerable situation. People can't access the situation. What more do you think the Committee to Protect Journalists and the international community can do for you and journalists in Yemen?
Thank you, Diane, for the chance. As I told you at the beginning, that we need much pressure because it works. As Lena said, in her case, such pressure was successful, and we have been experiencing that when there is a kind of pressure, international pressure on the political actors in the country, they feel like they wake up and they start to review their deals with the journalists. If there are, if the International Federation of Journalists and the CPJ and the other committees and think tanks that they are advocates for the journalists' rights and protecting the journalists all over the world, if they pay more attention to us, those who are working in such sick environment, I think everybody will reconsider to deal with the journalists and start to feel that they are under pressure and they are observed. So they will review their politics, their policies regarding the treatment with us. Because this is the only thing that works here. Those people, even the radical groups, the political actors, even the war merchants. This is specifically, I want to tell you about this because this war has produced lots of warlords, those who are benefiting from the war. Those are becoming the most dangerous threat for us, because whenever you start writing or investigating any problem or any issue concerning the society here, those people they feel alert and they start to find ways to threat journalists who are working on this. I experienced this 2 months earlier. I was starting like investigate report about controlling some lands illegally. These lands are considered like state revenues, and those war merchants just controlled it and started selling it for individuals and behaving like the state. I started drafting like investigative report about them, and the moment I just started to put my plans, I received like text messages threatening me to stay away. They told me, please stay away, otherwise you will lose everything. This was so. This put lots of constraints and leashed us just to work on shallow things. We don't dare to go deep and do like investigations and studying cases of corruption, of such things, because we feel that we are under threats. So if there is much pressure, if there is much solidarity with us from outside, from the international community, from partners, I think the situation will be better.
So in that case, did you decide for your own safety and security that you needed to back off from reporting on that?
Absolutely, yes. I just put it off and stopped it.
It's tough. It's tough because, especially since you're so cut off there, it's even the public pressure, I think, can be limited. The other thing that's we're dealing with in the COVID era is a lot of us are working more online, dealing with sources using Signal and WhatsApp, and we've seen, as Justin mentioned, the use of spyware is growing. We all get documents from government officials that can be used to plant spyware. I'm wondering, sort of, open this up to maybe start with Lena. How much Egypt has been, quite adept at using this since the Arab Spring. How do you deal with this problem with spyware and trying to report using these apps? Is it a substitute, or have you been able to find ways to navigate this world?
Yes, surveillance has been on the rise in different ways, both targeted and mass surveillance, and it became an integral part of being a journalist to have full awareness of safety and protection mechanisms online. And that is not just a personal responsibility in terms of protecting oneself, it's also a collective responsibility to protect other team members and to protect also sources primarily. So for example, we have like almost an informal sanction system within MEDA, within my organization, if people are lax with some of their security practices, for example, such as using Facebook messaging as a tool of communication with sources, for example, or with colleagues on work matters. These are straight don'ts in our practice. In parallel, we've been resorting more and more to encrypted end-to-end encrypted communication services. Also more and more internal servers to manage communication amongst us as team members. Really trying as much as possible to encourage sources not to speak to us on regular communication mechanisms. So there has been a lot more awareness, and like I said, it became much more imprinted once it transcended personal responsibility and became about sources protection and collective responsibility for other team members. I mean, of course, the use of online communication and the encrypted side of them increased with the COVID situation and with everything going online. But at the same time, like I said, this has been an ongoing trend for us in the last few years, not just during the pandemic.
Justin, are there any tools, any recommendations CPJ is able to offer in this area? And you talked about a little bit the expansion of spyware. What can journalists in the region do to protect themselves?
Sure. First of all, if you're looking at the chat, I actually just dropped a link to our safety kit, which links to a whole bunch of other resources on our website, and that covers a broad spectrum of advice ranging from digital security using encrypted apps to also social media and psychological health too. But to get to the other part of your question, it is something that, like I said earlier, has become more ubiquitous. It's something that journalists do need to be very aware of and attendant to in terms of their day-to-day practices. I can also say that it is something that we have seen, and this is something where the numbers don't really tell the story in terms of statistics or cases with press freedom, how the ubiquity and usage of spyware, surveillance technology, even the fear of it, has had an impact on reporting throughout the region. It's something where even for us as an organization, it makes it very difficult, even the prospect of, for example, reaching out to someone in Saudi Arabia, for example, is something that's very fraught and could immediately put someone in peril. And I know it's something that a lot of other organizations and researchers deal with as well. And this adds up to a sum total of there being a lot of reporting that's being silenced because there is an understanding far beyond the documented cases, which require a lot of forensic effort to prove, that this type of technology is ubiquitous. It's everywhere, and it can affect sources, it can affect journalists themselves, the people they speak to, and even their readership too. So I think that, again, we put this safety information out there, we're updating it constantly, but again, this is something that demands much more concerted action at the international level too, in terms of there need to be much stronger controls on the export and use of these very powerful tools, which are becoming increasingly common and which are increasingly being sold and justified in their use in terms of countering crime, terrorism, etc. There needs to be some mechanism for independent, transparent accountability for how and when these tools are used. And I think that there needs to be an understanding of the long-term effect on information as a whole. I think I want to go back to 2 points that are made, one by Zahra on this role of disinformation, which he brought up in the context of online trolling and abuse. And I think that this also is relevant when we talk about spyware and surveillance too. If people are afraid to pursue these stories, then it just creates a vacuum where more disinformation can come in, whether that's government sponsored or otherwise. And the other point I want to circle back to too was what Ali was saying before in terms of the threats that he received after trying to pursue the story in Yemen, which is that I think that as this spyware surveillance technology becomes more common, it does create this internal censorship where people pause before they pursue a story, before they reach out to a source. And at the end of the day, what these numbers on press freedom, what these articles don't cover is how many stories we don't hear that are not being told because they're not being reported, because of this climate of surveillance, of online trolling, harassment, prevents people from pulling the trigger on a story in the first place.
Thanks. We're winding up a little bit. Zahra, can you talk just a little bit about, from your perspective, you've covered a lot of, you've covered the region, you've talked with a lot of people. What in your mind is would you say is the biggest threat to journalists right now in the region?
I would say threats from authoritarian regimes, basically that sums up pretty much all of the challenges that we have touched on. Those threats come specifically from authoritarian regimes who make a concerted effort to silence journalists, sometimes resulting in death and detention. So that would certainly be the biggest. And that can come in a number of forms, and one of them is cybersecurity.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Lena, would you agree with that assessment? Is it the government repression and the crackdown that's the most difficult challenge?
Absolutely, I agree with Zahra. I'd add to it that, the specific way in which this authoritarianism manifests is this major institutional deficit that we have that could produce homegrown journalism that we are in dire need for. For journalism to happen, it needs to be groomed through institutions and organizations where, editors and reporters are learning from each other, are developing on the job. And, with this very difficult environment in which we operate, it's hard for these institutions to exist, to compete with each other, to learn from each other. And hence we have a problem with the vocation, with the job itself, with the profession itself and its evolution.
Great. Well, thank you all for being part of the discussion today. Your work is valued by so many more than you even know. It's important work in all the regions, and there's fewer and fewer people that are covering it. And so I'm sure I speak for everybody on this panel in thanking you for the work, and hopefully the message about more international pressure and public pressure will be heard, and people can keep an eye on and help out in the next situation when journalists in the region are detained. Thank you very much. Eid Mubarak.